Hello everyone, I'm Benjamin, and this is the Seeth Designs Sentient V1, and this is the V2. And actually, this is just one of the blade shapes. The V2 adds this reverse tonto or Wharncliffe blade. You can see this is the bite handle indicator, so this would be the sharp side. And you can see it really is a reverse tonto, because you see this is the tonto, and that's the bite handle indicator, so that's the sharp side. There they are next to each other. And they're not exactly just mirrored image, because you can see that this blade is thicker, which does affect the flipping, but I'm getting ahead of myself. If you've not seen it yet, I've done a full video on the V1 when that came out, and you can watch that if you want to learn more about this balisong. And also try not to restate too much of the information and just focus more on the differences. But there's some pretty unique design features of this balisong, and Seeth Designs, he has a full review guide that has a ton of information. You should definitely go check it out if you are interested in these balisongs, because it's just really interesting to see into his design process and to see the unique design elements and features and quirks of this balisong. So I'm not going to cover everything in a ton of depth, but I'm just going to run through some interesting things. And real quick, I did want to say that I was sent these for free from Seeth Designs to make this video on, so just take that with a grain of salt. I did not purchase these with my own money. They're $35 each, but everything I'm going to share in this video is of course my own opinion. I just wanted to let you know that. And of course, I'll have a link to Seeth Designs website in the description if you're curious in checking out these more. It's not an affiliate link or whatever. I just like to make sure you can actually find these. This balisong is plastic. Not just that, it is 3D printed, and it is also a resin print. How that affects this balisong is that it is not the most durable plastic option that we have available. And that is something that Seeth makes very clear, that these balisongs are not durable. They should not be dropped on hard surfaces like concrete or hard floors, just because cracks can develop and they can break. Now it's also cool because Seeth does have a nice warranty policy for these balisongs, where the first time you break either a blade or a handle, all you have to do is pay shipping and he will replace it for free. And then after that, all repairs will be full price plus shipping. So that's cool to see, because as well, this balisong is $35, which that's another improvement over the V1. It is $10 cheaper, I believe, which is really cool to see. And as well, there's other interesting things, like there are actually 8 washers, which is supposed to just help with this being a plastic balisong as opposed to, having the typical 4. And as well, it is also just the design philosophy behind this balisong is it is not designed to be a competitive flipper or a typical flipping experience like a normal metal balisong. It is really leaning into the uniqueness of its design. Now the Sentient is longer than the typical balisong. Here's just the Hydraken for comparison. And you can see that it is noticeably overall longer, but also the thickness of the handles, while it is definitely thicker than the Kraken handles, I don't think it's proportionally as thicker as it is longer. Meaning, even though the handles are on the chunky side, they're not super chunky considering that this balisong is so long. But then also, because the balisong is long, but it just doesn't have a lot of weight overall, even though you have the whole, moment of inertia affecting how longer balisongs will feel different to flip, because there's overall it's such a low weight, I find that I don't think that the overall increase in size and length has as big of an impact on its flipping experience as you might initially expect. And that is another thing to note about this balisong, that it is light. With the heaviest weights installed, it is still under 2.5 ounces, and it definitely flips like a very light balisong. That is another improvement over the V1, the weight system. They both have a weight system, but you can see that there is more plastic added to the bottom of the handles, which obviously that's going to add more weight. But more than that, it means now that the V2 is designed to hold more than one weight. This is the V1 without the extra weight. You had just 2 sets of weights, and you could jam the lighter one on the bottom. And so you can see that it does stay in there and it does work. But now this V2 is designed so you can have 2 weights in there, and it's going to be more secure, which is nice. And not only that, you have 3 weight options with the V2. So you can see in this bag, I have 4, but that's because he sent me both of these balisongs. So that's why I have 4, but you'll get a total of 6 weights. Quick thing about when I did test out the different weights, it was totally fine on the Tonto. I like took the different weights out, put it back in, but I wanted to test it out on the reverse Tonto one as well. And when I did that, I was flipping it. I did some like ladder or something, and a weight just flew right out of the handle just because like the plastic is just soft, and still, even though the hardening is better, it still is somewhat malleable. Now, luckily in the review guide somewhere, he mentions that if you want to, like if your blade does bend a little bit or something, like you can warm it up with hot water or warm water, and then you can kind of gently move it back into position. And so I put the weight in and then ran it under cold water, and the weight has been fine ever since. So that's just something to note. But yeah, it's because of this resin material is just such a, you know, non-standard for a reason for balisongs, just because it's really soft and but also brittle. It just has some quirks to it, but it turned out fine in the end. Now, technically, I don't have the heaviest weights in possible. I have the heaviest weights in that Seeth Designs recommends, which is the light and the heavy. Technically, if you wanted to do the same kind of janky setup as you could do with the V1, you could put the medium weights in with the heavy, and that would be heavier. But once again, it's kind of stick out, and it doesn't hit the blade, so that's fine, it works. But I found that weirdly, even though it did add more handle weight, which I do think can be nice, I think it just made it overall too handle biased and made the lack of weight in the blade more apparent. I was not a huge fan of it. But before I talk more about that, there's one more thing included. It says always store the Sentient V2 on its side, not its back. So you don't want to store it like this, but rather like that. The reason for that being, you can see that my V1 blade is a little bit warped over to the side. And I've actually, because I stored it like this for too long. That's another improvement over the V1, is that the UV hardening process has been improved. So these should be fully hardened, whereas the V1s were still a little bit soft. And I've definitely noticed that. It's apparent in the texture. This one feels more like a regular plastic to me, which is something that has happened with the V1, is that I have the screws insanely loose, like they're almost gonna fall out, because I think my pivots just got a little bit warped, and so the handles are binding. Also, if that happens to you, Seeth Designs did tell me that I could probably just lightly, carefully sand down the inside of the pivots, but I have yet to do that. Another improvement on the V2 is the jimping. Now, the document says that more jimping lines were added, which is true. You can just see that right there. The jimping extends further up. But what stuck out to me is that the jimping just feels more aggressive on the V2 than it does on the V1, and that was the wrong side of the blade. Just constantly switching between these two blade shapes is confusing. Anyway, I think it might just be because the hardening of the V1 is not finished and it has that softer texture, that maybe that's just why the V2 jimping just feels a little bit more aggressive. But either way, that's a bonus. And another thing that I'm thinking is potentially because of that is one of the things that I really liked about this V1, still do, is how quiet it is. And the V2 is definitely louder. These balisongs are also kind of hard to do sound tests with. They're not very bouncy. Of course, they don't really have tight tolerances because they're plastic. Probably also need to tighten screws. Anyway, this one feels a little bit quieter than this one. Hopefully you can tell on camera, but in person, in order, this is definitely the quietest, and then this one, and then this one. And as well, the difference in texture, these definitely, like, I feel like if I had to lay it out, it would probably be like that. You could definitely tell that these are both a lot more hardened than this one. This one just feels a little bit softer. So I don't know if maybe this green one was just slightly less hardened than this one. So that's why it is a little bit quieter and feels just ever so slightly softer, but there's that. Another thing with the storage of this balisong is that there's an integrated like spacer thingy. So when you store it, it's supposed to help prevent the blade from warping. Now, I did store, of course, my V1 properly with the spacer that was included with that and the rubber bands like he recommended. But I think just due to the V1s not being fully hardened, that's probably why it ended up having the warped pivot area, and as well, because I stored on the side, the blade drifted over time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the reason why I did not like having the kind of hacky medium and heavy weights as opposed to the light and the heavy weight is because this balisong is just overall really light, and it kind of threw off the balance. Because it is just so light, there is not a lot of weight to move around when you're flipping. I mean, anybody that's flipped a plastic balisong knows this, But this is also a really light plastic balisong. The Frank P and the Squiddy A are both around 2.6 ounces. And with the heaviest weights, the Sentient V2 is 2.4. And because it is a well, it's just so long, that means it's also just proportionally, it's less dense. And so you just don't have a lot of weight to move around when you're doing tricks. So it definitely gives it a unique feel, that is for sure. Another improvement the V1 has over the V2 is that it is heavier. There's a little bit extra plastic overall, like the bottom part I mentioned has a little bit more plastic. These extra design holes have been removed, or it gets filled in, so that adds a little bit weight, so there's a little bit more plastic weight. But additionally, there are more weights that have been added into the blade. So I think, was it 2 more? I think from 11 to 13. And of course, the heavier weights in the handle. And so because of that, the extra weight, it definitely is noticeable on the V1. And of course, this is the Tanto I'm talking about, and comparing it to the V1 Tanto. So comparing those two, the weight is noticeable. The weight difference is noticeable. And overall, the V1 does flip a little bit better. But how does the reverse Tanto fare? I definitely like the reverse Tanto more, how it flips. It actually has more weight than the Tanto. You can see, if we compare the blades, if you line them up side by side, or I guess if I do flip it around and then put them over top of each other, it's a little hard to see. You can see it just sticks out a little bit. A little bit harder to see on camera, but the blade is the same thickness here. And then as it goes up, it protrudes out this way a little bit here. And then more noticeably as it goes up, it protrudes out here. So you have a little bit more plastic overall. And so that definitely helps. In addition to that, it has the same number of weights in the blade, lining up by the pivots, but you can see that the weights are further towards the tip on the reverse Tanto. So because of that, this blade has a little bit more blade weight, and the additional weight is towards the tip of the blade as well. Because of that, the reverse Tanto definitely fans a little bit better, but that also begs a question, does the Tanto chaplain better than the reverse Tanto? Because typically that's how the trade-off works. And I think it does. In my testing, I think it might be ever so slightly stickier, but from what I can tell, these both chaplain well enough. And I don't even think it's that big of a difference if this one does happen to chaplain a little bit better. So for me personally, I would definitely take the improvements to the fanning performance to take maybe a marginal hit to chaplains. But it's not just as well how this fans, it just overall feels like it just, to me, it just has a better balance, and it feels like it flows a little bit better, because I think, yeah, like it's just like I've been saying, it's just a very light balisong, so there's not a lot of weight to move around. And so you might think, oh, well, if handle bias feels like it has more handle weight, then wouldn't that be better for a lighter balisong? But it's not that handle bias means more handle weight always. Typically with handle bias balisongs, they might feel like, okay, yeah, they don't fan as well, but they do really well in rollovers, and you have a lot of handle weight to work with. But because this one's just so light, it feels like it's still handle bias, but it feels like you just don't have a lot to work with. And so because of that, I would rather have the weight be a little bit more distributed easily, because this one just doesn't feel as committed. You know, it feels more neutral. I think because it's overall less weight and feels more neutral, it also feels more nimble and agile. And so overall, I just like it better. And I'm also gonna say all that with like, these aren't that different. There's 1 gram of weight difference between them. So it's like, it's not like a huge difference, but at least for me, it is noticeable. That's another thing as well. When I got these balisongs in, I gravitated towards this one over the regular Tanto. And part of that is probably just, I really like this green color. I think it looks really cool. And I just thought this blade shape was really cool. You know, that like Warncliffe blade. I also like the Tanto. I think they both look cool, but it was just new. And so because of that, I think I was just vibing with this one more. And so I wanted to pick this one up to flip it. I don't know if it was just because of that, I just perceived that I liked it more, or just wanted to pick it up more and flip it. Or if it was that I was, you know, subconsciously noticing the difference in the flipping because of the difference of the weight and distribution. So there's that. Now with all that being said, how does the V2 compare to the V1? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. The V2 is way better. Starting off, the fact that it's $10 cheaper, if that was the only change, that would already make it better. But on top of that, all of the improvements to the hardening process, the increased weight overall, the new blade shape, which I think even flips better than the previous one. And everything else that I mentioned, these are definitely an improvement, a noticeable improvement on the V1. That being said, these are still, at their core, it's the same balisong, just a little bit better. So what I mean by that is that it's still a resin 3D printed balisong that is very light, larger, and it's not meant to flip like a metal balisong or replace a metal balisong. Even like some plastic balisongs, kind of their intention. So while these definitely flip better, I wouldn't get these for the flipping experience, or rather for a more competitive and better flipping experience, if that makes sense. Obviously, you can get them for the flipping experience of, hey, I want something that's unique, something that's quiet, something that is very light, something that's larger. Those would be good reasons to get this. Or of course, if you like the aesthetics, the collectability, those are also good reasons. Or of course, just to support a smaller designer, that would be a good reason too. That would be my overall conclusion with these is, while yes, these do flip better, I don't want to diminish the fact that you don't get these balisongs because you want a really solid competitive flipping experience. Because you want something unique and something collectible, something cool. And in the process, you still get something that you can do all the tricks on and that you can flip really well with. So I think that's cool. And I was thinking about, what is the value proposition with these balisongs? And, the design philosophy, one of the things is want this to be a collector's item. And at first I was like, it's kind of weird. Like when you think about collectible balisongs, I think of ones that are really rare, and just being able to 3D print one just doesn't make this feel rare, or something that's really expensive, which also sometimes is because it's rare. But either way, this doesn't seem like the typical collectible balisong. But I think there are collectibles that are cheaper. Think about Funko Pops come to mind. Those aren't expensive to buy, yet people love to collect them because of the variety, at least what I can tell. That's one of the reasons. So I think that would be really cool to see with the Sentient going forward, is just a lot more options. And obviously you have to go through the work of designing these things. I understand that just because you're printing it doesn't mean that there's not a ton of work that goes into all the modeling and time that goes into the printing and all that. But it could just be really cool to see a bunch of different blade shapes and maybe even different handle styles. And then that way it's part of the collecting goes into oh, which blade shapes, which blade shape would you get for your Sentient? And so, I don't know, maybe that could be something that, maybe for the V3 or even just those new blade shapes for the V2 could be kind of cool. But of course, people like to get specific numbers when they're collecting as well. As you can see, I have number 55 and 69. So there's that. Now, if you didn't know, Seeth Designs has made more than just plastic balisongs. He's also made these reblades for the Volp. And I have a whole video on it where I go over all of the reblades and everything, all my thoughts on that. So if you're curious in that, then you should check out this video next. Thanks for watching.